I'm 27, he's 28, and I'm still honestly stuck on the fact that this whole thing could have been nothing if he had just paid for the dinner and dealt with whatever his feelings were later. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not because I think he's some kind of bank account, not because I'm trying to rob him through mozzarella sticks and cocktails or whatever dramatic version he probably has in his head now, but because sometimes when you're with somebody, there are moments where you can either make things easier or make things worse, and he absolutely chose worse. I invited my friend Sarah after she asked if she could come. I know that. I changed the plan. I did it because she's been having a rough time, and I didn't want her sitting alone in her apartment again doing that thing where she says she's fine, and then sends 6 voice notes in a row that are somehow half joking and half crying. Her breakup was 3 months ago, and people keep acting like that means she should be over it by now, which is such a neat fake way to look at things. 3 months is nothing when your whole life gets turned upside down. I don't care that she cheated. That doesn't make getting dumped feel good. That doesn't make waking up alone magically noble and healing. Heartbreak is still heartbreak. Shame on top of heartbreak is still heartbreak. I don't know why people want pain to become invalid the second the person suffering it did something wrong first. Sarah and I have known each other for years, longer than he's been around. He knows her as my friend, which she is. That's the category he has for her, and honestly, I never saw a reason to complicate that because it was a long time ago and done and not relevant to my actual life now. We dated briefly in our early 20s. It ended fine. No cheating, no huge dramatic collapse, and none of the stuff people usually mean when they ask if 2 people have history. We just didn't work as girlfriends and work better as friends. That's all. I know people always act like once 2 women have dated, there's supposed to be this permanent weird energy forever, but there really isn't unless somebody decides to make it weird. I didn't. Sarah didn't. The only person making things weird right now is my boyfriend, because apparently a meal and 1 awkward pause at a restaurant are enough to send him into some whole moral crisis. Anyway, Sarah was having one of her lower weeks. I could tell. She gets meaner when she's really hurt, which I know sounds bad, but I don't even mean scary mean, just brittle and kinda nasty in this careless way where she says things she probably shouldn't and then acts like she was joking if you call her on it. She'd been texting me all afternoon. Nothing huge, just little annoying messages. A picture of her closet half open with, "I hate every piece of clothing I own." Then something about how everybody in her office is suddenly engaged or pregnant and she hopes the building catches on fire. Then a screenshot of her ex's profile picture because apparently he looked too fine for someone who should be devastated. That kind of mood. So when I was already getting ready to meet my boyfriend for dinner, I asked if Sarah could join. He said sure, literally said it was no problem. Which is why I do not understand why he's acting now like he was ambushed into some hostage negotiation. If you agree someone can come, and that someone is obviously going through it, then maybe be a little flexible about the night not being exactly as tidy and coupley and controlled as you imagined it. Dinner was actually fun at first. Sarah looked good in that overdone way she gets when she's trying to prove something to herself. Full makeup, a tight black top, hoop earrings, and heels that she always regrets after an hour. She kissed my cheek when she sat down and made some joke about me rescuing her from eating shredded cheese over the sink again, which got me laughing immediately. My boyfriend smiled, but one of those restrained little smiles, like he was already bracing for the evening to become a Sarah event. He does that sometimes with people who are bigger personalities than his. He's not rude exactly, just kind of quietly judgmental. You can feel him measuring. Sarah ordered a drink right away, then another. She got appetizers for the table without asking much, but it was dinner, not some hostage situation, so who cares? She wanted dessert too. Fine. She hadn't really eaten all day, and she's been all over the place lately. And yes, maybe she was talking too much, but she was trying. That's what annoyed me later when he kept reducing it to numbers, like, she ordered so much, and her share was almost as much as ours. Okay? And sometimes people order what they want at dinner. Sometimes they're trying to have a nice night after feeling like trash for weeks. It was not a Michelin tasting menu. It was one meal. There were a couple moments where she said things about him that, looking back, I know are probably the kind of things other people would decide are giant red flags, but honestly, they only became a problem because he chose to make himself the center of everything later. At one point, he was talking about work, something about budgets or deadlines or whatever, and Sarah leant towards me a little and muttered that he sounded like somebody who would remind a waiter he ordered no pickles as if it were a legal issue. I laughed because it was funny. It was also kind of true. He heard part of it and asked what she said, and I just said she was being annoying, which she was, but she was drunk and sad and trying to get a rise out of me more than him. Later, she said, after he went to the bathroom, that he had the energy of a man who tracks favors in his head. Again, was that nice? No. But was she wasted and heartbroken and in a bad place? Yes. I'm not saying she should get a lifetime pass to say anything she wants. I'm saying context exists. People get ugly when they're hurting, especially Sarah. I know that about her. It's not some revelation, and I didn't think I needed to stop the entire dinner and scold her like a child in front of him, because that would have been humiliating and dramatic and pointless. I told her to stop being rude. She rolled her eyes, took another sip of her drink, and said she was kidding. That should have been enough. He was quieter after that, though, not sulking exactly, but definitely in that mode where he's storing things. He does this thing where his face doesn't change much, but the whole conversation starts feeling narrower, like everything now has to pass through his internal quality control before it can exist. Sarah and I were still talking, mostly about dumb stuff, and I know maybe we slipped into a rhythm that left him out a little, but that happens when two people have known each other forever. It doesn't mean something sinister is happening. Sometimes it just means one person knows the backstory on why a certain song or phrase is funny and the other doesn't. That's normal. Then the check came, and this is where, apparently, the world ended. He put his card down. He did it naturally, not with some big speech, because usually he covers me when we go out, and sometimes I get the next thing or I pay for coffee or whatever. It's not this rigid system, so I looked at him and said, "Oh babe, can you get Sarah's too?" Because it was obvious. She was my guest. She was having a bad time in life. We were already all there. He had his card out. The server was standing there. It was just easier and nicer and more normal to do it that way. Instead, he hesitated. That was honestly the worst part, not even the words at first. The hesitation. People don't understand how much can happen in 1 second at a table. I saw his face change. I saw Sarah notice it too. I saw her pull back inside herself immediately. And then he said, I wasn't really planning on that. I don't even remember exactly what happened in my chest in that moment, except that it was hot and immediate and I wanted the floor to open. Because now it wasn't about dinner anymore. Now it was a public little lesson in what he does and doesn't approve of. Now Sarah was sitting there as this obvious burden. Now I was the girl who had to ask twice. So I said, it's just easier if you do. And I meant easier for everybody. Easier than making the server separate it all while Sarah drunkenly fumbled for her wallet. Easier than making her have that horrible little fake laugh conversation where she's like, no, I've got it, while clearly wanting to disappear. Easier than taking what should have been one smooth, generous gesture and turning it into a weird accounting exercise in the middle of the restaurant. Sarah went quiet. That's how she gets when she's humiliated. People think she's all mouth all the time, but when she feels exposed, she goes still. She started reaching for her bag and saying she could send me money or whatever, but by then the damage was already done. It didn't matter that he ended up paying. He paid like someone signing off on a complaint. You can feel when somebody gives reluctantly. It sticks to the whole table. I was furious. Still am, honestly. Outside, Sarah thanked him, then thanked me, which made me feel even worse, because she only thanked me because she knew I was the one trying to smooth it over. She hugged me and whispered that she was sorry and that she shouldn't have come, and that immediately made me defensive because why should she be the one apologizing? For eating. For existing at dinner while sad, for not wanting to have a humiliating wallet scene after 2 drinks. It made me hate him for a second, in this very pure, uncomplicated way. When she left, he started and almost immediately. Asked why I put him on the spot. Asked why I assumed he'd pay. Asked why Sarah ordered so much if she couldn't cover herself. Just one dry, controlled question after another, like he was building a little case. And I was already done with his tone before he even finished the first sentence. I told him he was making a big deal out of nothing. He said it wasn't anything to be expected to pay for someone else without being asked first. I said she's my friend and she's had a horrible few months. He said that doesn't make him responsible for her dinner. That word, responsible, irritated me right away because nobody said anything about responsibility. That's exactly how he twists things. A basic decent thing becomes this giant burden in his head. Nobody asked him to cover her rent. It was one meal. One. She had a breakup. She's been spiraling. She came out with us. She drank too much. She said a couple rude things because she was drunk and heartbroken, and yes, she can be an arsehole when she's hurting. I know that. But none of that changes the main point, which is that the person I'm with should have had enough social sense to just handle it and let us leave with some dignity. He asked what rude things she said, so obviously he had heard more than I thought. I told him not to be dramatic. He said she'd insulted him more than once. I said she was drunk and upset, and not everything is about him, which I stand by the way. A lot of what Sarah says when she's in that state isn't even really about the person she says it to. It's just shrapnel. He's an adult. He could have let it roll off him for one night instead of deciding this was the moment to suddenly grow a conscience. He said I was excusing disrespect. I said he was acting cheap, and yes, I meant it. Maybe not in the strict financial sense, though honestly kind of that too, because if you can afford to cover dinner and your girlfriend's friend is sitting there in obvious distress, then why are we doing this whole performance over appetizers and dessert? But mostly I meant cheap in spirit, small, ungenerous. The kind of person who can ruin an entire night over the principle of not wanting to feel taken for granted. I understand not wanting to be used in theory. I just think sometimes men weaponize that feeling so fast. The second a woman expects softness or ease or social grace, suddenly they're being exploited. It's exhausting. He kept saying it wasn't about the money, which was rich considering how much he talked about what Sarah ordered. He said it was about me volunteering him. He said it was about being blindsided. He said it was about me acting like his card was just there for whatever situation I wanted to manage. I remember saying, "Oh my God, listen to yourself," because what else do you even say at that point? He had turned one awkward dinner into this referendum on respect and boundaries and consideration, and all I could think was that a person who is actually generous doesn't need a 3-business-day notice period first. Then he asked, out of nowhere, why I was so intense about Sarah specifically. I said because she's my friend. He said it seemed like more than that. I told him he was being weird, and he kept looking at me in this really steady way that made me feel suddenly cornered, which annoyed me because I was already angry and did not need him adding some investigative energy on top of it. He asked if there was anything about Sarah I hadn't told him. I asked what that was supposed to mean. He said it meant exactly what it sounded like. Honestly, I think if he hadn't already pissed me off so much over dinner, I might have answered better. But because I was still stuck on how embarrassed he made that whole situation, it felt less like an honest question and more like him trying to catch me in something so he could retroactively justify being difficult. So I got defensive immediately, which, fine, probably didn't help. But he wasn't exactly asking in a trusting, loving way either. We got back to my place, and the fight just kept stretching, same points over and over, except now with more edge on them. He wanted me to admit I was wrong for asking. I wanted him to admit he handled it badly. He wanted me to see that Sarah had been rude. I wanted him to stop acting like a drunk, recently dumped woman making a few bitchy comments was some kind of targeted abuse campaign. He asked again if Sarah and I had ever dated. I hate that I hesitated, because apparently hesitation is as good as a confession. But I did. Mostly because I already knew what would happen next. It wouldn't matter that it was years ago. It wouldn't matter that it ended. It wouldn't matter that I'm with him now and not secretly trying to rebuild some epic romance out of martinis and shared fries. The second he knew, every interaction with Sarah would get dragged backwards through that new filter. I said it was a long time ago. He asked if Sarah knew he didn't know. I said yes, and then suddenly he was acting like the dinner wasn't even the issue anymore. Like this whole thing was actually about honesty and what he was walking into, without realizing, and whether I'd left out something important on purpose. Which, again, I think is him making everything bigger than it needed to be. There are things that matter because they are current and active and actually affecting the relationship. And then there are things that are just old facts. Sarah is an old fact. He is acting like she is some hidden active threat because he needs a bigger reason to justify why he made such a scene over the bill. He said I let him sit at dinners and hangouts and have conversations with somebody I had history with without telling him. I said because it didn't matter. He said clearly it mattered to me. That irritated me so much I nearly laughed. Of course she matters to me. She's one of my closest friends. That's not the gotcha he thinks it is. People are allowed to care deeply about people they dated once. Adults do that all the time. Life is long. History doesn't erase itself because somebody new arrives. I'm not going to act like Sarah is disposable just because it makes things neater for him. Then he asked if I would have told him at all if this dinner hadn't happened. And I said something like, I don't know. Maybe if it ever became relevant. Which was apparently the wrong answer because he just stared at me like I'd confirmed the worst possible version of me in his head. He went quiet, Ben. Not calm, exactly. more like shut down in a way that made me even angrier because now somehow I was supposed to comfort him after he had embarrassed me, embarrassed Sarah, dragged out a pointless money issue, and then turned the whole thing into an interrogation. I asked if he was seriously going to sulk now. He said he was trying not to say something he couldn't take back. I told him that was dramatic. He said maybe he should leave before this got uglier. And instead of stopping him, I said maybe that was best if this is who he turns into over one dinner. I know that sounds harsh. Maybe it was. But I meant it in that moment. Because the longer the night went on, the more I could feel something shifting in me that I didn't like. Not guilt, not really. More like disappointment curdling into disgust. I kept seeing his face at the table when I asked him to cover Sarah. That little pause, that tiny flinch of resistance. I don't know how to explain how unattractive that felt to me without sounding cruel, but there it is. He put his jacket on. He asked for one thing before he left, the full truth next time, before I put him in a room with it. I said if he needed a formal disclosure packet every time someone from my past was still in my life, maybe he wasn't mature enough to date an adult. That was probably the meanest thing I said all night. He just looked at me for a second, opened the door, and left. About 20 minutes later, Sarah called. She was crying, which I hate because her crying voice still does this thing to my whole nervous system where I get instantly irritated and protective at the same time. She said she knew he hated her. She said she shouldn't have ordered dessert. She said she had probably ruined my relationship and she was sorry. I told her no, he was being ridiculous, and I meant that. I still do mostly. I said he was making it into some weird ego thing. She said, drunk and bitter and sniffing, that he had cheap little manager energy, and that she always knew he was one of those men who make women feel expensive for needing anything. And yes, I defended that too. Not the exact phrasing maybe, but the feeling underneath it. Because she was drunk and heartbroken and humiliated, and honestly not entirely wrong. I told her to stop talking, but I was also pacing around my kitchen thinking, is this really what I want? A boyfriend who can't absorb one uncomfortable dinner without making me feel like I submitted a reimbursement request. By the time I finally sat down, it was after midnight, my makeup was half off, my phone battery was at 9%, and I was staring at his last message. I'm home. We'll talk tomorrow when we're calmer. Feeling not calmer at all. Mostly I was thinking something I probably should have felt worse about. That maybe this relationship is more effort than it's worth if this is how he behaves when generosity would have cost him one card swipe and a little pride. Then Sarah texted right after that, don't let him make you feel bad for taking care of your people. And I wish I could say that didn't hit exactly where I wanted it to. But it did. Continuation. I posted a few days ago about the dinner situation with my boyfriend and my friend Sarah. I didn't expect the reaction I got, honestly. A lot of people seemed very focused on the money or on the fact that Sarah and I used to date years ago. I still think people are missing the point of what actually happened that night, but things have gotten more complicated since then, and I guess I'll just explain what's happened since. The night after the fight he left my apartment, I was still angry. Not the kind of anger that burns out quickly either. The kind where every time you replay the situation, you find another thing about it that makes you feel even more justified. Sarah came over the next morning with coffee because she felt bad about the dinner. She had apparently woken up hungover and convinced she'd ruined everything. I told her she hadn't ruined anything, that my boyfriend had made a weird power move over a restaurant check and then decided to turn it into some moral crusade about honesty. She kept apologizing though. At one point she said she should have just grabbed the bill before he could even react. She said she'd transfer me the money for everything if that would fix it. That annoyed me, because the point wasn't the money. The point was that my boyfriend had chosen the absolute worst moment to suddenly grow a backbone about principles. When someone is sitting right there feeling embarrassed and vulnerable, that's not the time to start debating fairness. But Sarah still felt responsible. She kept saying she shouldn't have ordered so much and that maybe she had been rude to him. Yes, she had said a couple things about him being uptight or cheap during dinner, but she had been drunk and upset. She was 3 months out from a humiliating breakup and still figuring out how to exist in the same social circles as her ex. Of course, she was going to be messy sometimes. That's what friends are for. You don't abandon someone because they're messy. Anyway, while we were sitting there talking, my phone kept lighting up with messages from friends. Apparently, my boyfriend had already talked to one of them. I'm not sure exactly what he said, but the version that got back to me was basically that I had put him in an unfair situation, and that I had hidden a relationship with Sarah, which is a ridiculous way to frame something that ended years ago. But hearing that made me realize something pretty quickly. If I didn't explain my side first, he was going to control the story. So I told a couple of friends exactly what happened. I told them he embarrassed Sarah in the middle of dinner over a bill. I told them he made it awkward and humiliating for everyone at the table. I told them he turned one uncomfortable moment into a whole lecture about respect and boundaries. And yes, I told them that Sarah and I dated years ago, but that it ended amicably and had absolutely nothing to do with our current lives. Most of them reacted the way I expected. They thought he had handled it badly. A couple of them even said it sounded like he had been looking for a reason to pick a fight, which honestly made me feel a lot less crazy about my reaction. But things didn't just stop there. 2 days later, I decided we needed to actually talk face to face instead of letting everything fester through text messages. He had been pretty quiet since the fight. Just one or two neutral responses, nothing emotional, nothing heated. That silence bothered me more than if he'd kept arguing. So I suggested we meet for dinner again, same restaurant. Not because I'm dramatic, but because I wanted to prove that the situation didn't have to be a big deal. And yes, Sarah was there again. Before anyone jumps on that, she offered to stay home. She actually insisted on it. But I said no because the whole point was to clear the air, not to pretend she didn't exist. A couple of other friends came too, so it wouldn't feel like an ambush or some intense confrontation. When my boyfriend walked in, he looked immediately uncomfortable. Not angry, just closed. Like he had already decided something before the conversation even started. We all sat down and tried to keep things normal for a while. Small talk, drinks, the usual stuff. Sarah was quieter this time, probably because she still felt guilty. At one point, she actually said directly to him that she was sorry about the last dinner and that she would pay her part this time. He nodded and said that would be appreciated. That was the first moment the whole table felt weird, because his tone wasn't forgiving or warm. It was polite in that distant way people use with strangers. Eventually, one of our friends asked if we were going to talk about what happened the other night, so we did. I explained again that I had asked him to cover Sarah's meal because it felt like the kind thing to do in the moment. He said the issue wasn't the money. He said the issue was being put on the spot and expected to agree. Then he said something that honestly pissed me off again. He said that after learning Sarah and I had dated, the whole dinner looked different to him. Like I had been asking him to fund an evening for someone I had a romantic history with. That framing felt so gross to me. I told him that was ridiculous. People stay friends with exes all the time. It doesn't automatically mean there's some secret emotional triangle happening. But he kept coming back to the same point. That he had spent months hanging out with Sarah without knowing that piece of history. That he felt like everyone else at the table understood the dynamic except him. Sarah tried to smooth things over at that point. She said it had been her idea not to mention it because it felt like ancient history, which is true, but apparently that made things worse. He asked her why she was still so involved in my life if the relationship had ended. The way he said it made it sound like she was some kind of lingering problem. Sarah looked hurt, and I immediately jumped in because I wasn't going to sit there while he interrogated my friend like that. I told him he was making things weird again. That this was exactly the kind of controlling behavior that bothered me the first time. Then one of our friends asked him why the dinner bill had bothered him so much if it really wasn't about money, and that's when things started spiraling. Because instead of backing down or softening, he said something like, because it felt like I was being asked to play along with something I didn't understand. The table got quiet. I asked him what that even meant, and he said he didn't appreciate being the only person in the room who didn't know the history between me and Sarah. That he felt blindsided, that he felt like everyone else was in on something he wasn't, like I had tricked him into dating me. Sarah tried again to diffuse things by saying she would pay her part of the meal and that none of this needed to be dramatic. But by then the energy at the table had shifted. One of my friends pointed out that my boyfriend seemed more upset about the past relationship than about anything Sarah actually did. Another said it sounded like insecurity. And I'll admit, hearing that out loud made me feel validated in the moment, because that's exactly how it looked to me. Like he couldn't handle the idea that I had a life before him. My boyfriend just sat there quietly while people talked. He didn't interrupt, he didn't argue, he just watched the conversation happen. And then when the server brought the check, he reached over, took it, looked at it for maybe 2 seconds, and pulled out his card. But instead of paying the whole thing, he said very calmly, "I'll just cover my own tonight." He handed the server his card and asked her to split it. That moment felt like a weird reversal of the first dinner. Except this time, nobody was embarrassed except maybe him. Sarah immediately said she would cover the rest. But he stopped her. He said she didn't know him anything, and then he said something that made the whole table go silent again. He said the dinner bill had never really been the issue. The issue was realizing halfway through the relationship that the dynamic between me and Sarah wasn't what he thought it was, that he felt like an outsider in something he hadn't agreed to join. I told him that was dramatic. I told him he was acting like a coward, a spineless man who couldn't handle complicated friendships. I said real partners support each other's emotional lives instead of policing them. A couple of my friends nodded. Sarah looked uncomfortable, but I was already too frustrated to stop. I told him he clearly didn't understand women or friendships or what it means to show up for someone who's hurting. That if one dinner was enough to make him question everything, maybe he wasn't strong enough to be in a real relationship. He listened to all of that. And then he stood up. He said he didn't think this conversation was going anywhere productive, and he left the restaurant. After he left, the table kind of exploded with opinions. Some people thought he had overreacted, others thought he looked exhausted, Sarah mostly just looked guilty. But I was still angry. So later that night, I sent him a long message. I told him I was willing to give him one chance to prove he could actually be supportive and mature about this situation. One chance to show that he valued the relationship more than his pride. Otherwise, maybe we weren't compatible. I thought that was reasonable. If anything, I felt like I was being generous, because I was still willing to work through things. His response came about an hour later, and it was shorter than I expected. He said he appreciated the offer. But from his perspective, the relationship had probably been over for a while. That the dinner incident just made it obvious. He said he didn't feel like I respected him or even liked him very much, and that he didn't think either of us would be happy trying to force something that clearly wasn't working. Reading that honestly shocked me, not because we hadn't been fighting, but because I didn't expect him to just accept the breakup like that. No pleading, no arguing, no attempt to convince me to reconsider. Just calm acceptance, which somehow felt worse than if he had fought for it. I showed the message to Sarah and a couple of friends. They started comforting me, saying he sounded emotionally checked out, saying he was probably intimidated by how strong my friendships were, saying some men just can't handle women who have complicated lives and histories. And maybe that's true, I don't know. Part of me still thinks he overreacted to something that should have been a minor moment. Another part of me is starting to realize that maybe he had been quietly unhappy for longer than I noticed. But if that's the case, he should have said something instead of waiting until everything exploded over one dinner. Because from where I'm standing, it still feels like he chose the worst possible moment to make a stand, and I still don't understand why being asked to support someone I care about was such a huge problem for him. Maybe I never will. Analysis. I'm just going to say it straight because this situation is honestly kind of wild, and the narrator is still completely missing the point of what actually happened. First thing, the dinner bill was never the real problem, and the boyfriend figured that out way earlier than she did. She keeps obsessing over the money because it's the easiest thing to argue about. It's just one dinner. He could afford it. Why make it awkward? That's the shield she's hiding behind. But from the boyfriend's perspective, the issue wasn't 20 or 50 bucks worth of food. The issue was being put in a situation where he was expected to say yes in public or look like a jerk. That's social pressure, plain and simple. She volunteered his wallet without asking him beforehand. That's rude even if it's a small amount of money. And the fact she still doesn't get why that annoyed him tells you a lot about how she operates in relationships. But the dinner moment actually triggered a much bigger realization for the boyfriend. Halfway through that original dinner, he found out that Sarah wasn't just some random friend. She was someone narrator used to date, and apparently everyone else already knew that except him. That's the part that really messed with his head. Imagine sitting there at a table where two people have history, inside jokes, and emotional shorthand, and you're the only one who doesn't know about it. That's uncomfortable as hell. Narrator keeps saying, it was years ago, and it's not relevant. That's easy for her to say because she's the one who knew the whole time. The boyfriend didn't get that choice. He walked into months of interactions thinking Sarah was just another friend in the group. When that kind of information pops out later, it makes you start rethinking everything. Every dinner, every hangout, every moment where those two seemed a little too familiar. Even if nothing shady actually happened, your brain still starts replaying things differently. And instead of acknowledging that feeling, narrator basically mocked him for it. That's where she really lost him. Look at how she talks about him during the fight. She calls him cheap, cowardly, spineless, and insecure. She keeps saying he doesn't understand women or can't handle complicated friendships. That's not someone trying to fix a relationship. That's someone trying to win an argument, and she did it publicly. That second dinner was honestly brutal from the boyfriend's perspective. Imagine walking into a conversation where your girlfriend has already told the entire friend group her version of events. Everyone there already thinks you're the bad guy. Then the whole table starts questioning your motives. That's not a conversation, that's a courtroom. And narrator doesn't even realize she set it up that way. She genuinely thinks she was clearing the air. In reality, she created an environment where the boyfriend was basically surrounded by people defending her and Sarah. At that point, the guy was already checked out emotionally. You can tell by how he behaved. He didn't argue, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't try to convince anyone, he just sat there quietly while the group talked about him. That kind of quiet usually means someone has already decided something internally. The moment with the check at the second dinner is actually pretty telling too. Instead of repeating the same situation, he just paid for himself and stepped away from the whole dynamic. That wasn't petty. That was him refusing to play the same role again. And then he said the real issue out loud. He felt like an outsider in something he never agreed to be part of. That's the cleanest summary of the whole situation. Narrator and Sarah have a very tight emotional bond. They dated, stayed close, and still operate with a lot of familiarity. That's not automatically wrong. Plenty of people stay friends with exes, but when you bring a new partner into that dynamic, you have to be honest about it up front. Otherwise, it feels like you're sneaking someone into an already established emotional system. The boyfriend realized he wasn't just dating narrator. He was dating narrator plus Sarah's orbit. And Sarah clearly had influence in the relationship. She was criticizing him during dinner. She was insulting him to the narrator afterwards. And narrator was defending her the entire time. That's a miserable position to be in. No one wants to feel like they're competing with their partner's best friend, especially when that friend is also an ex. The final breakup message actually says a lot too. He didn't insult her. He didn't argue. He just said the relationship had probably been over for a while. That line is important because it suggests this dynamic with Sarah had been bothering him for longer than the dinner incident. The dinner just forced the issue out into the open. Narrator thought she was giving him an ultimatum. Prove you're worthy or we break up. But, from his perspective, the relationship was already failing, so the ultimatum didn't scare him. It just confirmed what he had already been thinking. That's why his response shocked her. She expected drama. Instead, she got calm detachment. And that kind of response always hits harder than anger because it means someone has already emotionally stepped away. The most frustrating part of the whole story is that narrator still thinks the central conflict was generosity versus stinginess. She keeps repeating that he should have just been kind and paid for dinner. But kindness in relationships isn't just about money. It's also about respect, honesty, and awareness of how your actions affect your partner. Narrator expected unlimited understanding for Sarah's emotions because she was heartbroken, but she gave almost zero understanding to her boyfriend's feelings about being excluded, embarrassed, and misled about an important part of her history. That imbalance is what actually killed the relationship. And the irony is that Sarah herself seemed more aware of the problem than narrator was. She apologized. She offered to pay. She looked uncomfortable when the argument escalated. Narrator was the one who kept pushing the conflict further and further. By the time she called him a coward and told him to prove he was worthy, the relationship was already done. He just hadn't said it yet. Honestly, the boyfriend handled the final stage pretty well. He didn't insult anyone. He didn't escalate the fight. He simply removed himself from a dynamic that clearly wasn't healthy for him. Meanwhile, narrator is still surrounded by friends telling her she's right and he couldn't handle a strong woman with complicated friendships. Maybe that's partly true, but it's also possible he just didn't want to be in a relationship where his partner constantly prioritized someone else's feelings over his and then called him weak when he finally pushed back. And that's probably the real takeaway here.